Have you ever wondered what evil looks like when it smiles back at you? Picture this, a small mining town where everyone knows everyone, where trust runs as deep as the coal veins beneath their feet. Now imagine that same community erupting in celebration, applauding, cheering for a killer. They even gave him a gold watch. This is the story of how an entire town got it wrong. How justice failed so spectacularly that it became an invitation for murder. And how sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we refuse to see. Welcome to Abertillery, Wales, in the winter of 1921, a place where the truth wore a mask, and nobody thought to look underneath. The Welsh valleys in winter are unforgiving. Coal dust settles on everything like ash from some ancient fire, and the fog rolls in so thick you can barely see your own hands. In Abertillery, the mine whistles cut through the silence before dawn, calling men into the earth's belly while their families pray they'll return. It's February, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. And somewhere in these narrow streets, between the identical row houses and the corner shops that smell of tobacco and desperation, something terrible is about to happen. Harold was 15 then. 15 and working at a local shop, the kind of quiet boy who blended into background, the kind adults forgot about until they needed someone to blame. His father worked the mines, came home black with dust and too tired to notice the strange light in his son's eyes. His mother kept house and asked no questions she didn't want answered. But here's what nobody understood about Harold. He was watching, always watching, learning the patterns of the town, the rhythms of its people. And somewhere in that watching, something darker began to take shape. Her name was Frida, 8 years old, with the kind of trust that only comes from never having a reason to doubt the world. On that February morning, her mother sent her on a simple errand, buy some feed for chickens. Such a small thing, such an ordinary thing. But ordinary things have a way of becoming extraordinary when they intersect with darkness. Frida walked into Harold's shop with coins clutched in her small fist, probably humming to herself the way children do. Harold was there, behind the counter, watching her with those pale eyes that seemed to see too much. What happened next? That's where the story begins to fracture, where truth becomes something slippery and hard to hold. What we know is this: Frida never made a home. The feed was never bought. And when they found her body in the alley behind the shop, broken and discarded like a forgotten doll, the whole town held its breath. The police found Harold's handkerchief near the scene. They found blood on his clothes. They found inconsistencies in his story that twisted and changed like smoke. But they also found something else, a community that wouldn't believe that one of their own could do such a thing. You see, Harold didn't look like a monster. Monsters, we tell ourselves, should be obvious. They should announce themselves with wild eyes and foaming mouths. They shouldn't be quiet 15-year-old boys who say, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," and help elderly ladies with their shopping. The courtroom was packed, standing room only, with people pressed against the walls and spilling out into the corridor. Everyone wanted to see the boy who couldn't possibly have done what they were saying he did. Harold sat in the dock, pale and composed, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He answered questions in a soft voice that barely carried to the back of the room. He looked, by all accounts, like a victim himself, a victim of circumstance, of bad luck, of a justice system desperate for answers. His lawyer painted a picture of reasonable doubt, so thick you could cut it with a knife. Yes, Harold was there. Yes, his handkerchief was found near the body. But where was the weapon? Where was the definitive proof? Where was the smoking gun that would put this tragedy to rest? The prosecutor did his best, But the evidence was circumstantial, built on suspicion and coincidence rather than cold, hard facts. And in a courtroom, suspicion isn't enough. Coincidence isn't enough. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Not guilty. Have you ever heard 3,000 people cheer for a killer? It's a sound that stays with you. It echoes in your dreams and whispers in your quiet moments, reminding you that crowds can be just as blind as individuals, just as wrong, just as dangerous. Harold walked out of that courtroom a free man, and artillery erupted. They lined the streets as he made his way home. These good people, these honest mining families who worked hard and believed in justice. They applauded him like a war hero, like someone who had done something brave, instead of someone who had gotten away with something unspeakable. George Little was there in the crowd, a neighbor, a man with callous hands and kind eyes who probably never hurt a soul in his life. He clapped Harold on the shoulder and said the words that would haunt him forever. "Well done, boy. We knew you didn't do it." George Little. Remember that name. Remember the kindness in his voice, the genuine relief in his smile, because this story isn't finished with him yet. They gave Harold a gold watch that day, a beautiful thing, engraved with his initials, paid for by public subscription, a symbol of their faith in his innocence, their joy at justice served. Harold took that watch with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He thanked them all, these people who had saved him from the gallows, who had chosen to believe in him when the evidence suggested they shouldn't. And somewhere in that smile, in the weight of that gold watch in his pocket, something else was taking shape, something that had been waiting, patient and hungry, for just this moment. If you believe stories like this should be told, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. 17 days. That's how long the celebration lasted before it curdled into something else entirely. Harold went back to work, back to his quiet life in the shadow of the mines. But something had changed. The acquittal hadn't freed him. It had unleashed him. Because if you can convince an entire town of your innocence once, what's to stop you from doing it again? The gold watch ticked steadily in his pocket, marking time until the next opportunity, the next moment when darkness could slip through the cracks of ordinary life. And that moment was coming sooner than anyone could have imagined. George Little lived 3 houses down from Harold, close enough to wave good morning and borrow sugar when times were tight. He had a wife who baked the best bread on the street, and an 11-year-old daughter named Florence who had her father's kind eyes and her mother's quick laugh. Florence was the kind of child who made everyone smile. Bright, curious, full of the unshakable optimism that comes from being loved unconditionally. She had no reason to fear the quiet boy from down the street, the one her father had defended so publicly just weeks before. Why would she? Harold was innocent. The court had said so. The whole town had celebrated it. On July 8th, as summer heat shimmered off the cobblestones and children played in the streets, Florence Little made the mistake of trusting in that innocence. We don't know exactly how Harold lured her into his house. Perhaps he offered sweets or showed her something interesting in his window. Perhaps he simply asked for help with some small task, the way neighbors do. What we know is that she went willingly. No struggle in the street, no cries for help that went unheeded. Just a bright, trusting child following someone she had no reason to fear into a house that would become her tomb. Inside that house, with the curtains drawn and the door locked behind them, Harold did what he'd been planning to do since the moment they handed him that gold watch. He killed again, but this time was different. This time, there was no rushing to dispose of the body, no panicked attempt to cover his tracks. This time, he took his time. He hid Florence's body in the attic and went about his business as if nothing had happened. When George Little came knocking, asking if Harold had seen his daughter, Harold looked him straight in the eye, the same eye that had watched him celebrate Harold's innocence, and lied with the ease of someone who had been practicing. "No," he said, "I haven't seen Florence today." And George believed him. Of course he believed him. Why wouldn't he believe the boy he had defended, the boy he had celebrated, the boy who wore that gold watch like a badge of honor? They found Florence's body in Harold's attic 3 days later. 3 days of George Little walking the streets, calling her name, checking every hiding spot a child might choose. 3 days of a mother setting an extra place at the table just in case. 3 days of hope slowly curdling into the kind of despair that changes you forever. When confronted with the evidence, Harold didn't rage or deny. He didn't claim innocence or point fingers at others. Instead, he sat down and wrote out a confession in his careful schoolboy handwriting. "I have a desire to kill," he wrote, as simply as if he were describing his favorite color or his plans for the weekend. A desire to kill. Not rage. Not revenge. Not even madness in any way we could understand. Just desire, pure and simple and terrifying in its honesty. The police officers who read that confession said later that it was the most chilling thing they had ever encountered, not because of what it revealed about Harold, but because of what it revealed about the nature of evil itself, how it could exist without reason, without justification, without any of the explanations we use to make sense of the senseless. Harold was 15 years old when he wrote those words. 15, and already so far gone into darkness that he could name it, claim it, confess to it without shame or regret. The second trial was different. There were no crowds cheering for Harold this time, no neighbors lining up to vouch for his character. The gold watch sat heavy in evidence bags, its cheerful ticking finally silenced. George Little sat in the front row, his kind eyes hollow with grief and guilt. The man who had celebrated Harold's innocence now faced the reality of what that celebration had cost. His daughter's life, his family's peace, his faith in his own judgment. The verdict came swiftly this time. Guilty. But here's where the story takes another strange turn. Because Harold was still just 15, still technically a child in the eyes of the law, he couldn't be executed. Instead, he was sentenced to be detained at His Majesty's pleasure, essentially a life sentence, or as close to one as the system could manage. They sent him to Usk Prison, where he would spend the next 20 years learning to be a man behind bars, fed by the state that failed to stop him, protected by the same system that had let him kill twice. 20 years to think about what he had done. 20 years to plan what he might do next. Harold was 35 when they let him out of prison in 1941. The world had changed while he was locked away. Another war was raging, and Britain needed every able-bodied man it could find, even the ones with blood on their hands. Somehow, impossibly, Harold managed to enlist in the British Army. Perhaps he lied about his past, or perhaps the military simply didn't ask the right questions. In wartime, bureaucracy has a way of cutting corners, of prioritizing necessity over safety. They sent him to North Africa, to the desert campaign where men died every day and nobody asked too many questions about where you came from or what you'd done before you put on the uniform. 4 or 5 years, Harold served his country in the sand and heat of Libya, fighting alongside men who had no idea they were sharing foxholes with a killer. Did he kill again during those years? Did the chaos of war provide him with opportunities to feed that desire he had confessed to so matter-of-factly? We'll never know. War has a way of hiding bodies, of making death seem ordinary and necessary rather than criminal. If Harold did kill during those years, His victims became statistics in a larger tragedy, lost in the noise of a world tearing itself apart. When the war ended, Harold Jones disappeared. In his place emerged Harry Stevens, a quiet man with no past who settled in London and lived the kind of anonymous life that cities make possible. London in the 1950s was a perfect place to reinvent yourself. Bombed-out neighborhoods were being rebuilt. Records had been lost or destroyed, and nobody asked too many questions about where you came from as long as you paid your rent on time and didn't cause trouble. Harry Stevens didn't cause trouble. He worked ordinary jobs, lived in ordinary flats, and blended into the gray mass of post-war London like smoke into fog. He was invisible, unremarkable, the kind of man you could pass on the street every day for years without ever really seeing him. But invisibility, for someone like Harold, wasn't just a convenience. It was a weapon. Between 1964 and 65, something terrible stalked the streets of London. Women began disappearing from the city's West End. Young women, vulnerable women, women whose absence might not be immediately noticed by anyone who mattered. When their bodies were found, they told a story of methodical violence that sent chills through Scotland Yard. The killer was organized, careful, and completely without mercy. The press dubbed him Jack the Stripper, a name that echoed the Victorian horrors of Jack the Ripper while acknowledging the unique brutality of these modern crimes. The investigation consumed hundreds of officers and thousands of hours, but the killer remained a ghost. He left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no evidence that couldn't be explained away or discredited. After 8 murders, he simply stopped, vanishing back into the anonymity of London's 8 million souls. The case was never solved. But here's what's interesting. During those same months when women were dying in West London, Harold Jones, sorry Harry Stevens, was nowhere to be found. No employment records, no rent receipts, no trace of the quiet man who had been living his invisible life for more than a decade. It's possible, of course, that this is just coincidence. London is a big city, and people disappear from records for all sort of innocent reasons. But when you're dealing with someone who has already killed twice, who had confessed to a desire to kill, coincidence starts to feel like something else entirely. What drives someone to kill? Not once, in a moment of rage or passion, but repeatedly, methodically, with the kind of cold calculation that suggests something fundamentally broken in the machinery of the human soul? Harold never offered any explanations beyond that simple confession. I have a desire to kill. No tales of childhood abuse, no trauma that might excuse or explain his actions. Just desire, as basic and inexplicable as hunger or thirst. Perhaps that's what makes his story so disturbing. We want our monsters to have reasons, to be products of circumstance or victims of their own damaged histories. We want to believe that evil grows from something identifiable, something we can recognize and prevent. But Harold suggests a different truth, that sometimes evil simply is, that it can exist without reason or justification. We're in the face of an ordinary person and hiding behind a mask of community trust. The people of Abertillery weren't fools for believing in his innocence. They were human beings doing what human beings do, looking for goodness, hoping for the best, trusting in the fundamental decency of their neighbors. The tragedy isn't that they were wrong about Harold. The tragedy is that people like Harold exist at all. Harold Jones, Harry Stevens, died on January 2nd, 1971, in a hospital bed in Hammersmith. Bone cancer had eaten him from the inside out, and in the end, the man who had taken so many lives died alone and unremarked. Just another number in the mortality statistics. The nurses who cared for him in his final weeks remembered him as polite and quiet, grateful for small kindnesses and never any trouble. He died as he lived most of his adult life. Invisible, unremarkable, carrying his secrets to the grave. No one came to his funeral. No flowers were sent. No tears were shed. The boy who had once been celebrated by an entire town, who had been given a gold watch and the benefit of every doubt, slipped out of the world as quietly as he had slipped through it. But the questions he raised, the doubts he planted, the damage he did to the very idea of trust and innocence, those things lived on. Whatever happened to that gold watch, the one given to Harold by the people of Abertillery in their moment of misguided joy? Did he keep it through his years in prison, through his service in the war, through his quiet life as Harry Stevens? Or did he throw it away the moment he realized what it truly represented? Not their faith in his innocence, but their willingness to be deceived by the very evil they refused to see? Perhaps it doesn't matter. The watch was never really about time, anyway. It was about timing. The terrible timing that put Frida in Harold's shop on that February morning, that put Florence within reach of his hungry darkness, that allowed a killer to walk free, because good people wanted to believe in goodness. Time, as Harold learned, can be a weapon as sharp as any blade. It can hide crimes and erase evidence. It can turn suspicion into doubt and doubt into acquittal. It can give a killer 20 years to plan his next move, and then set him loose in a world that has forgotten what he is capable of. So here we are at the end of Harold's story, and the question that haunts every true crime narrative rises up like smoke from the ruins. Could it happen again? Are there other Harolds out there, wearing the masks of ordinary citizens, collecting gold watches and community trust, while feeding desires too dark to name? Are there other George Littles, good people whose faith in human decency makes them blind to monsters walking among them? The uncomfortable truth is that there probably are. Evil doesn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks. It smiles and says please and thank you. It helps elderly ladies with their shopping and accepts gold watches with humble gratitude. It looks, in other words, exactly like the rest of us. And that's the most terrifying thing of all. The next time you find yourself in a small town where everyone knows everyone, where trust runs deep and people still leave their doors unlocked, remember Harold Jones. Remember the boy who fooled an entire community, who turned their goodness against them, who used their trust as a weapon. Remember that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like a quiet 15-year-old boy with pale eyes and careful handwriting. Sometimes it accepts gold watches and says all the right things and makes you believe that the world is a safer place than it really is. Sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we refuse to see. And sometimes the only thing standing between us and the darkness is our willingness to admit that it exists at all.